Welcome, dear students. The focus of the current session is defense of borrowing compromise. I hope and expect that by the end of this session, you would be able to critically evaluate why there was a need for a borrowing compromise and what were the situations or circumstances that led towards that. Well, my dear students, amongst the scholars and linguists and the people with knowledge, there was a division, there was a discrepancy when it came to whether there should be borrowings in English language or not. Whereas there were certain, more traditional and more conservative scholars and linguists who believed that borrowings should not be there, there were other group of people as well who supported the borrowings in the language and tried to justify those borrowings. When we talk of borrowings, Dryden asserted, "I trade both with the living and the dead for the enrichment of our native tongue." So, he goes to this extent that he says that from wheresoever, from the living languages or the dead languages, from wheresoever we need to take words, he says, I would trade with them. In order to do what? In order to enrich, for the enrichment of his native tongue, that is English. He continues, "We have enough in England to supply our necessity, but if we will have things of magnificence and splendor, we must get them by commerce." And for that, the analogy that he has given, the comparison that he has given is that, even if we have sufficient stuff in our country, still if magnificent stuff is available somewhere else, why not to trade that? Why not to get that through commerce? And same goes for language. Even if language in itself is sufficient for our use, still we can make it more, grand, we can make it more magnificent through borrowings. The innovators who wanted innovations in language, they also had the precedence, from other languages as well, because English was not the first language that tried to borrow. If we look at the history of Latin and French and all other languages, we would notice that almost every language hugely borrowed at some stage of its life. Languages keep on borrowing. There may be times when, this process of borrowing would be slow depending upon the needs. Then there may be times when the process would be sped up. But the process somehow continues. The supporters of borrowing also said that the strangeness of the new words soon wears off. People get used to them and then they become a part of the language. Mulcaster, who was a schoolmaster and who was a strong supporter of English language and who wanted to promote it and wanted to give it a new form and shape, he observed, "We must first become acquainted with any new thing and make the thing familiar if it seem to be strange." So, what he says is that on the grounds that borrowings are strange, they should not be rejected. Rather, they should be adopted. They should be borrowed, and people should make themselves familiar with them so that they become a part of the language. My dear students, he further continues to say that for all strange things seem great novelties and hard of entertainment at their first arrival. So what he actually gives as a logic is that it is not only language, rather in every case of life, in every domain of life, whenever there are new things, human beings find it hard to, get used to them. And then he says, till they be acquainted. Once people become acquainted with them, familiar with them. But after acquaintance, they be very familiar and easy to entreat. So he's justifying that borrowing should be done, and once people would get acquainted to them, it would be very easy for them to use. Actually, what he's trying to do is he's trying to give answer to the objection that borrowings make English language difficult. Anyways, he continues, familiarity and, the second thing that he says is acquaintance. He says that the ease that is needed, it would come through familiarity and acquaintance because they will cause facility, both in matter, that is in terms of contents, and in words. So, he is a strong supporter. So, my dear students, when we talk of the borrowing compromise, of course, there were people who opposed this compromise as well and who didn't want it to happen, those who were not in favor of borrowings. But then there were people who supported. Actually, the opposition to Incoterms was at its height in the middle of the 16th century. All right, just to give you a clarity on what are Incoterms. What are these Incoterms? An Incoterm is a word, a vocabulary item that is borrowed from some other language, and that is not borrowed out of necessity. That is just being pretentious, just for the sake of fashion, just unnecessarily, that is borrowed. As you notice, a lot of people, for example, while in Pakistan using Urdu, where, just pretentiously they would be using certain words of English that would not much fit into the sentence, that would not be required or needed. So, people in those times would, use these Incoterms. They would, bring in words from Latin and French language just to show off. So this was a time when there was a strong opposition to this practice. In fact, my dear students, by the end of Elizabeth's reign, borrowing had gone so far, it had reached such a point that now actually had come a point when there was, this first question, whether there should be a borrowing or not, this was now out of question. Borrowing was already happening. It was going on there. Now the attack was directed from this perspective to another perspective, and that was that what kind of borrowing should be done. There should not be the abuse of, the whole process. So, the attack was that the way the borrowings are done, the way should be correct. Instead of the product itself, they would say it's okay to borrow, but borrowing should be with some caution. The use of unfamiliar words could be easily overdone, and actually the enthusiasts and the pedant, they said that while criticizing this, they said that there are people who criticize the use of these terms, and for that matter they give sweeping statements, generalized statements, like generally people say this is always done like this, this should not be done like that. So sweeping statements should be avoided. And interestingly, those who criticized about them, the supporters pointed out that they themselves were inconsistent in this regard, because they themselves were using certain borrowings, So Puttenham, for example, was a person who, pointed out, who warned against Incoterms and said that these terms should not be used. However, interestingly, he admits that he sometimes himself uses those terms. He defends, for example, the words scientific, major, domo, politan, that is politician, conduct, so not only nouns, but also a verb. So, he also used these borrowings, and he himself admitted that. My dear students, he says, the word significative, he says, doth so well serve the turn as it could not now be spread, and many more like usurped Latin and French words as method, methodical, function, assaulting, refining, compendious, prolix, figurative. He says these are the words that convey the meanings in such a way that if they are not borrowed, English language does not have sufficient resources to convey the ideas that are conveyed through these words. I would say nobody could avoid wholly the use of new words during these times. The only difference was that amongst the writers, there were certain who used them very frequently, the others used them, with some caution. And the borrowing compromise is actually the safest route, where, a middle track is to be taken, a middle course, a middle path is to be taken, where, borrowing was considered to be acceptable, but, it was asserted that it should be, it should be done with care and with caution. It should not be too much.